We are in the third week of a series called The Outsider. We've been going through the Gospels. I said when we started this, I was very excited to be back in the Gospels. If you've ever met me before, you know that they're kind of my favorite thing. And I was, it will seem like a bit of a left turn, but I was playing a game this morning called Connections. Have any of you played Connections? You're aware of what this is. If you haven't played yet today, do not look at the screen. I will warn, I'll tell you before it's up there. So if you're not familiar, Connections is a game on New York Times. And when you start, it brings up a screen that looks like this. It's just a bunch of words. 16 words, little grid, 4x4. And hiding in that list of 16 words are 4 groups that are connected together. And you've got to try to figure out what it is that connects these things. And as I was playing this morning, it occurred to me that the Gospels are in some ways a little bit like this. That when we read the Gospels, when we look at all 4 of them kind of together, when we combine them, we can certainly pull truths out of them. And there are certainly things about Jesus that we can learn from the Gospels if we kind of lump them all together. But when we look at them individually, when we kind of recognize what connect, and if you haven't played yet, do not look at the screen. When we start to see things that are connected in each Gospel, we can learn something new. We can draw more out of it when we make those connections. And we end up with something that, even though it's those same truths, we're able to put them together in a particular way to see things maybe a little more clearly. So you can take that off there so the people who haven't played yet aren't real. Okay, it's safe to look now. Oh, what? Were you like writing it down? You're like, I could have a perfect day. Let me just... If that's what you take away from the sermon today, how dare you? I'll be just kidding. No, it's fine. So we are looking at not just the gospel, but specifically at the Gospel of Luke. And looking at one of the things that Luke really focuses on, which is that in Luke, Jesus proclaims good news for the outsider. That Jesus in Luke's gospel is particularly interested in the outsider. And we've looked at a couple things. The first week, we looked at Jesus' first sermon, the first time Jesus proclaims the gospel or the good news in Luke. And it's specifically good news for the outsider and a challenge for the insider. Jesus says God is working, and he's working out there. And if you are so inwardly focused, you may miss it. And it may bother you. Remember, they tried to throw him off a cliff at the end of that sermon. Thank you, by the way, for not doing that. Last week, we looked at another maybe familiar story from the Gospel of Luke. Luke. Maybe I don't need more caffeine. I don't know what I need. I need some time. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a parable that we usually call the Good Samaritan. And that story reminded us that Jesus calls us to love first. He's not, it's our love. It's not our holiness or our obedience or our purity that will impact the world, that will kind of call outsiders to God. It is our love first. Not that holiness and obedience and purity and these other things are not important. We talked about that. But we should lead with love. And in many ways, that story challenges us to think about how the outsiders may have love figured out better than we do sometimes. Today's story is one of the more well-known stories from Luke, I would say. You know, every gospel has particular things that kind of are standouts, or the things that people recognize as being from this gospel or that gospel. So we talked not terribly long ago about all the I am statements. Remember, we spent 7 or 8 weeks in John. And Jesus says lots of things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. All these things from John's gospel. And so when we hear Jesus saying, I am blank, we're like, oh yeah, we must be talking about John. There's other things from John that maybe stand out to us. Things like, for God so loved the world. We hear that, we're like, oh yes, this is John. There are things from Matthew that maybe stand out to us. We spent a whole summer in the Sermon on the Mount. And so when we hear things like, blessed are the poor in spirit, we're like, oh yes, this is part of that gospel. We hear the Great Commission, go therefore into all the world. We're like, oh yeah, the end of Matthew. These are things that are kind of unique to each of those things, or that are kind of well known from those gospels. Luke has a few. that we've probably heard a bunch, even if we don't necessarily know they're from Luke. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. We've all heard that one. At the Christmas story, it's very well known in Luke. Another story from Luke that's very well known starts out, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was set upon by robbers. We just talked about that story last week. Comes from Luke. And then this story that starts out, there was a man who had 2 sons. And one of the sons, well, we'll hear about the sons in a minute. We usually call the story the prodigal son. So we're going to look at that story today. We're going to look and see what it has to tell us about the outsider, about how we relate to the outsider. And it's really, before we jump into it, it's really 2 stories. And I want us to keep this in mind. Anytime we look at a parable, it's sort of 2 stories. There's the parable story, but then there's kind of the larger story of the gospel. It's, why did Jesus tell this, or what's going on in Jesus' world that he tells this other story? So there's the parable story, and then there's the story that kind of prompts the parable or brings the parable up. And keeping both of them in mind, I think especially today, might help us see something important as we go through this series. So let's take a look. We start in Luke 15. Verse 1 starts like this. Now tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And Jesus told them this parable. It's really easy when we look at parables. Parables are so much fun. The stories of the parables are really different and entertaining in some way, and they're challenging. There's a lot to like about them. But it's easy to skip past the setup. To just kind of toss these verses aside, say, yeah, some things were going on. Jesus told a fun story. Let's get to the story. But I think that if we try to remember why Jesus tells these parables, it can help us get to the so what part of the parable. Because Jesus tells these stories for a reason. And remembering the reason, remembering the situation, can help us with the application. If we want to know what the purpose of this story is, what change it's supposed to bring about in our lives, remembering why Jesus told this story can help us get there. And so what we learn in those few verses is that Jesus is spending time with outsiders. How dare he? And the insiders get mad about it. And so Jesus tells them this parable. It's actually these parables. The chapter has 3. We'll only look at one of them closely, but it says Jesus told this parable, and he goes on to say something along the lines of, a man had 100 sheep, and one of them wandered off. And so he left the 99 sheep in the field, and he went and found the one, and when he found it, he rejoiced, and he went and told all his friends, you should celebrate with me because this was lost, and now it's found. And then he tells another parable about a coin. It says a woman has 10 coins, and one of them is lost. And so she leaves the other 9, and she sweeps the house, and she looks diligently until she finds it. And when she finds it, she rejoices. And both of these stories end with basically the same kind of conclusion. They say, in this way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 or 9 righteous persons who don't need repentance. Heaven rejoices when the outsider is brought in. This is the point of both of these stories. When the lost are found, heaven rejoices. And then he tells this third parable, which we're going to look at in sort of 2 parts. So in verse 11, it says, Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And so they began to celebrate. This is the portion, the story goes on, and we will get to the other part of the story, but this is the portion of the story, for the most part, that I think people are very familiar with. It's very similar to the other parables, the parable about the sheep and about the coins. And there's a good reason that we're very familiar with it. It's our story. We live this story. We experience this story. So in Luke, the younger son asks for his inheritance early, and a lot of people will make a big deal about it. This will say, it's like he said to his dad, "I wish you were dead so I could have my money." Cough it up. Maybe not. But he goes away, he spends everything, and at his lowest point, in his deepest need, he comes home, repentant. "I have sinned. I am not worthy. Make me like one of your hired servants." And in the story, the father sees him from a long ways off. The father, it seems, is looking for him. And it says he's filled with compassion, and he welcomes him home extravagantly. The story is sometimes called the prodigal son, right? You've maybe heard this term. Prodigal, not a word we use outside of the title of this story. Does anyone know what prodigal even means? It's a tough one. Well, the next time you're doing a crossword and it comes up, maybe now you'll know. Prodigal means, if you looked it up, it means to spend freely or even recklessly, or to give away on a lavish scale. This is what prodigal means. So we call him the prodigal son because he wastes everything. He throws it all away. And the son in the story is prodigal. He takes all that money and he runs off, and that money is gone. For whatever reason. But the son is not the only one in the story that's prodigal, and that's the amazing thing about this story. The father is prodigal too. The father gives on a lavish scale, recklessly, freely. The son comes home, and the father has already given him everything that he is entitled to. And still, when the son comes home, the father pours out blessings on him. And that's our story. And like so many things in Luke, that is good news for the outsider, for the person who is lost or who has run away or is marginalized. That when we find ourselves far from God, when we are at our lowest point, in our deepest need, we can always return home. God is seeking us. God is full of compassion and mercy towards us. God welcomes us home. And that is an important part of this story. And I don't want us to miss this part of the story when we get into the more challenging part. We'll get there, don't worry. But this is good news. And this is everyone's story. Whatever part you happen to be in it. Maybe you're still sitting in the pigsty. Maybe you're thinking about coming home repentant but haven't done it yet. Or maybe you have experienced the prodigal love of a father who sees you coming and welcomes you home. And we have an opportunity this morning to celebrate that, and we will get to the rest of the story, I promise. But I want us to stop here for a minute and think about and remember and celebrate in a lot of ways that part of our story. That we all, at one point or another, are the outsider, lost, alienated, outside. And when we come back, the Father welcomes us recklessly. The Father calls us to the table. He welcomes us in. So we remember that. We are thankful for that. We celebrate that each week as we gather together in our time of communion. That at this time, the bread reminds us of the body of Christ. The juice reminds us of the blood of Christ. We remember the sacrifice of Jesus when God poured out his love recklessly for us, welcoming us into his presence, calling us all to his table. So Luke starts chapter 15 with this, and I said that we wanted to remember the situation that prompts the story. So it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus, these outsiders. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And then Jesus told this parable. And I said, remembering the situation can help us with the application. Jesus is spending time with outsiders. Insiders get mad about it. And I think that in some ways that is the part of the prodigal son story we forget. Jesus' audience, the people Jesus is speaking to here, I think, is the insider. And he tells these stories to remind them of God's desire to find the lost. God rejoices, heaven rejoices when one is found. He tells these stories to remind the insider of God's prodigal, reckless compassion. And then the story goes on. And we get to an insider. And it goes like this in Luke 15, starting in verse 25. This is after the younger son comes home. The party has started. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. And the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Verse 31, my son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. If this story contains good news for the outsider, and I think it definitely does, it also contains some challenges for the insider, because Jesus tells these parables to insiders. And so I want to just leave us with three questions to think about, to consider for those of us on the inside as we think about how we relate to the outsiders in our lives, in our worlds. And I love, maybe we'll talk more about this next week, I love that in all of these stories, and again next week, all of the outsiders are different. You may remember in the first week, the outsiders were Gentiles, these people who were kind of religiously different. The next week, the outsider was a Samaritan. These kind of ethnic differences in some way. Here, the outsiders are tax collectors and sinners, these people who are different social positions, or maybe are kind of different in the, their holiness level, if I can even use the term. Next week, there will be a different type of outsider. So regardless of who the outsiders are, the people kind of on the outside fringes of your world, a few challenges from this part of the story, a few questions that I want us to think about as we relate to those folks. The first question is this: are we more concerned with our personal rewards than with showing mercy to other people? You see, when the younger son gets home and the older brother refuses to go in the house and dad comes out to see him, think about what the older brother says. All this time, I have been slaving away. I have never disobeyed you. And you have never given me anything for my trouble. And sometimes I think we are maybe tempted to believe that the end result, the end goal of our righteousness should be our reward, and not blessing others. God does not call me to do righteous things. He does not call me to obey so that I can punch my ticket to heaven. He calls us to obedience and goodness and mercy and compassion and all of these things so that we can bless the world, so that we can be his hands and feet to those around us, to the people on the outside, the people who are marginalized and hurting. So that's one question. Am I more concerned with personal rewards than with showing mercy to others? I think another question that we might think about when we think about how we relate to the outsider that we see in this story is, are we more likely to lead with compassion or with judgment? We saw this a little bit last time. This is a little pop quiz. It's a fun fact that I had not noticed before. Why is the younger son in need? Danny's not allowed to say because we talked about it the other day. That's why he's snickering over here. Why is he in need? There's a guy, I don't remember where he works these days. He's a New Testament scholar. His name is Mark Allen Powell, and he did this neat little experiment with his students where he had them pair off, and one student would read this story, the prodigal son story, to the other one, and then they'd both put him down, and then the person who listened to the story had to tell it back. And he said it was amazing when he did this in American seminaries that almost every time when the students recited the story back, at the very beginning they said, the younger son was in need because he wasted all of his money. And it's in there. That's what the story says. He spent all of his money on reckless living. But they leave out a really important part of the story. And I'm not going to put the scripture back up there, but you can look back yourself. It also says, before it talks about him being in need, that there was a famine in that land. In fact, it says it right before his need. He spent a lot of things, then there was a famine, and he began to be in need. And the same scholar, the same guy, did the same experiment with students in a seminary in Russia. He was in St. Petersburg, I think. And wouldn't you know it, all of those students remembered the famine but forgot the wasteful spending. And then he did the same experiment at a seminary in Kenya or Nigeria, I forget which one. And he wondered, are they going to be more like the American students? Are they going to be more like the Russian students? What part of this story are they going to pick out when they think about the son's need? And you know what? They didn't point to either of them. They didn't say anything about his wasteful spending. Most of them didn't remember the famine. There's another part of that story that says he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So maybe it's wasteful spending. Maybe it's circumstances beyond his control. Maybe it's the community around him that fails him. But the older brother has a very clear picture of what his younger brother has done. When the older brother is complaining to his father, the older brother, who only just figured out that his brother was even home, could not possibly know what he had been up to in this faraway country, says, this son of yours came back and he wasted all of his money on prostitutes. How does he know this? He probably doesn't. And this is what I want us to think about. It is true that people sometimes find themselves in dire straits on the outside, marginalized or whatever, because of their own choices. Sometimes it is because of circumstances that are beyond their control. And sometimes it is not a failure on their part, it's a failure on the part of their communities, on our part, to support them. The older brother reacts instantly with judgment, and that stops him from welcoming the outsider. The father does not do that. The father does not ask why he was in need. That is not important to him. He doesn't lead with judgment, he leads with compassion. He leads with love. We talked about it last week. And I wonder if sometimes we may be more like the older brother. That when we see someone on the outside, we see someone in need, we ask first, well, why are they in that position? What have they done that put them there? Rather than doing what the Father does and welcoming the outsider first. So first question, are we more concerned with our own reward than with showing mercy? Second question, are we more likely to lead with compassion or judgment? And then the last question, are we distancing ourselves from the outsider, or are we looking for common ground? Are we looking for a way to connect? It's one of the things that I really love about this story, one of the details about this story. It's so familiar, I think, maybe that's why I love it. The older son, he's out there in the field. He's grousing to his father. He's complaining. And he says, when this son of yours came back, you did these things. You left. Any of you parents out there have definitively done this. The text or the call, guess what your son or your daughter did today, right? You distance yourself. When they do something cute and adorable, it's like my child. But when they do something terrible, look what your kid, it's the same thing. He's distancing himself. This son of yours wasted all these things and you welcome him back. How could you? And the father turns it around. And I want us to look at this. This is right after the older brother has said, this son of yours. He says, my son, the father said, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. And then the last verse of the chapter, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and now he's found. I love the reminder that on the inside, whatever may make you different from the people on the outside, whatever got them there, they are your brother, sister, family. That we shouldn't look for reasons to distance ourselves from them, but we should look for common ground. We should look for opportunities to connect and show mercy. And lest I leave us on a depressing note, I've said several times that Jesus is very prophetic in the Gospel of Luke, and prophets, their job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and there's plenty of that in this story, that there is good news for the outsider, good news that the Father is seeking them and wants to welcome them back. There are challenges for the insider. Are you behaving more like the older brother? How can you be more like the Father? But I do want to kind of leave us with this note of encouragement that I think is really, even as I'm challenged with how I'm more like the older brother sometimes, I love this point that the Father goes out to meet both of them. I don't know where you're at today. You may be feeling the part of the outsider, whether outside of faith or just left outside, just barely hanging on, marginalized or hurt or oppressed or whatever it is. And I hope that you hear the comforting good news of Jesus' message, that the Father is seeking and the Father is ready to welcome the outsider in. And maybe you're the insider that needs a little challenge, we'll use it, from Jesus' words. A challenge in the way you look at those on the outside. But regardless of which one of those you are, the Father comes out to meet you. The Father runs out seeking the younger son. He meets him on the road, but he also goes out to find the older brother who refuses to come in the house. We have a God who comes out to meet us. Insider, outsider, doesn't matter.